Rachel says you're not family. Don't come. My son sent that text at 4:17 on a Friday afternoon, just as the peach pie was cooling on my kitchen counter and the butter was still softening for the biscuits I had planned to bake fresh at the lake cottage. I read the message once, then again, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less cruel if I stared hard enough. They did not. The kitchen suddenly felt too quiet. The ticking clock above the stove sounded louder than it had any right to. I stood there with my reading glasses low on my nose and one hand resting on the edge of the counter, trying to understand how a boy I had raised with bedtime stories, church on Sundays, and thank you notes at Christmas could reduce me to a sentence so small and so sharp. Not even his own thought. Rachel says, as if that made it softer, as if borrowing his wife's voice excused the cut of his own. I had been getting ready to leave for the cottage since noon. I had packed an overnight bag with my navy cardigan because the air by the lake always turned cool after sunset, even in late summer. I had wrapped the pie in a clean dish towel with tiny blue flowers on it, the same one my late husband, Thomas, used to call my company towel because it only came out when I expected family. There was a bowl of potato salad chilling in the refrigerator and a paper sack on the table with sweet corn from the roadside stand 2 miles outside town. I had even brought down the old tin of checkers from the pantry shelf because Daniel used to insist on playing after dinner when he was a boy, long before he became the kind of man who sent his mother a message like that and then went silent. I did not call him. I did not text back. I did not ask what Rachel had said, or why, or since when I had stopped being family to the people who used my husband's cottage every 4th of July, every Labor Day, every warm weekend that made the water sparkle like glass. I simply turned off the oven light, though the pie was already done, and stood still long enough to feel something settle inside me. It was not rage. Rage is noisy. This was quieter than that. Colder. The kind of clarity that arrives when your heart is hurt too deeply to keep pretending. I walked to the sink and washed my hands even though they were clean. It gave me something to do while the message sat there on the counter beside my keys, glowing on the screen of my phone like a tiny legal notice. Not welcome. Not family. Don't come. I dried my hands carefully, folded the dish towel over the pie, and looked out the window above the sink. My backyard was still. The bird feeder swayed a little in the breeze. The hydrangeas along the fence had begun to fade from bright blue to that dusty color they get just before fall. Everything outside looked normal. That was the strange part. The world does not pause when someone quietly removes you from the center of your own life. The world keeps moving. Ice melts. Clocks tick. Butter softens on the counter. And somewhere, at the lake cottage my husband and I paid for with years of sacrifice, my son and his wife were settling in as if the place had always been theirs. I picked up my phone one last time and read the text again. Then I set it face down. I took my overnight bag from the chair by the door and carried it back to my bedroom. After that, I returned to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and put the potato salad away. One by one, I undid every small act of welcome I had prepared for them. The pie, the corn, the biscuits I would no longer bake. By the time the counter was clear, I understood something I should have admitted a long time ago. Rachel had not changed my son in a single day. She had only given him permission to say out loud what he had been letting happen for years. And as I stood there in the silence of my own kitchen, I realized I was done begging to be included in a family I had built with my own 2 hands. That evening, I did not turn on the television. I did not call my sister or my neighbor or the one friend who still asked careful questions when she heard something strained in my voice. I made myself a cup of decaf coffee I did not want, then carried it into the living room and sat in Thomas's old chair by the lamp, the one with the faded brass pull chain and the shade that leaned slightly to the left. The house had a way of sounding larger at night since he passed. Every room seemed to hold its breath after sunset. The hallway stretched longer. The stairs creaked louder. Even the refrigerator in the kitchen hummed with a lonely kind of persistence, as if it, too, had gotten used to keeping things cold for people who no longer gathered around the same table. I set the mug on the side table without taking a sip and looked around at the life I had spent 38 years building. Not a grand life. Not a flashy one. But a good one. Honest. The framed photograph over the mantel showed Thomas in his canvas fishing hat, smiling into the sun at the lake, one hand lifted as if he had just called my name. Next to it was Daniel at 12, missing his 2 front teeth, holding up a string of perch like he had conquered the world. There had been summers when that cottage felt like the center of everything. We painted the shutters ourselves one June with a borrowed ladder and too much optimism. Thomas replaced the dock boards over 3 sticky weekends in July, sweat darkening the back of his shirt, while Daniel chased frogs along the shore and begged to hammer in nails he was too young to handle. I planted geraniums in window boxes every Memorial Day. I packed hot dogs, potato chips, citronella candles, board games, extra towels, and more groceries than 3 people could possibly eat. It was never only a property to me. It was where our family became itself. Or at least, that was what I used to believe. After Thomas died, I held on to the cottage with a kind of stubborn devotion I could not explain to people who told me I should sell it and travel or move somewhere with less upkeep. I kept paying the property taxes. I called the pest control service every spring. I had the porch rail repaired after a winter storm. I replaced the old water heater the year it started making a knocking sound in the utility closet. Daniel offered opinions, of course, but never checks. Rachel had suggestions, but never invoices. Somehow, though, they arrived for the pleasant parts. Long weekends, sunset photos, boats borrowed from neighbors, glasses of wine on the dock. Each year, little things shifted in ways I tried not to notice. My quilt disappeared from the guest room and was replaced by one Rachel said looked cleaner. Family photos came down from the hallway at the cottage because she wanted a more modern feel. The coffee mugs Thomas and I bought in Door County were pushed to the back of the cabinet, while Rachel's pale stoneware filled the front shelves as if she had always lived there. Once, I arrived on a Saturday morning with a blueberry buckle still warm in the pan and found the lock code had been changed. Daniel laughed it off and said Rachel was just being careful. Another time, I discovered my bedroom drawer had been emptied so Rachel could store extra swimsuits and candles. She smiled as if this were ordinary, as if I were the one passing through. Even then, I told myself families change. Sons grow up. Wives make homes in their own style. I swallowed each small humiliation the way women of my generation were taught to swallow things, quietly, without disturbing the room. But sitting there in the yellow lamplight with my untouched coffee going cold beside me, I could finally see the pattern for what it was. It had not begun with one message on a Friday afternoon. It had begun years earlier, in polite rearrangements and gentle exclusions. In Daniel saying Rachel prefers this and Rachel thinks that and Rachel already planned something else. A family is not always broken in one loud moment. Sometimes it is erased inch by inch, until one day you look up and realize there is no place setting left for you at the table you bought. The next morning, I woke before sunrise with the strange, brittle calm that comes after a hard truth has finally settled into place. I did not need an alarm. My body had already learned the habit of early mornings from years of packing coolers, slicing fruit, wrapping sandwiches in wax paper, and getting on the road before the heat built over the highway. For a moment, lying there in the half-light, I almost forgot. I almost thought it was one of those old summer Saturdays when Thomas would be shaving in the bathroom and Daniel would still be asleep upstairs, one long leg hanging off the bed, exhausted from staying up too late with a flashlight and comic books. Then I opened my eyes fully and saw the empty side of the room, the chair with my cardigan draped over the back, the silence where family used to live, and I remembered exactly who I was now in my son's life. I got up, tied my robe, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The tile floor felt cool. I filled the kettle and stood by the sink while the water heated, looking out at the faint gray line of morning above the fence. My phone was still on the counter where I had left it face down the night before. When I finally picked it up, there were 2 new messages. The first was from Daniel, sent at 9:08 the previous night. Hope you understand. We just want peace this weekend. The second came 30 minutes later from Rachel. Please do not make this awkward for everyone by showing up anyway. I stared at that one for a long time. Not because it surprised me. By then, surprise was no longer the right word. It was the precision of it that stayed with me. Make this awkward. As though my presence at a cottage my husband and I had paid for was some social misstep. As though I were an elderly neighbor who had mistaken the house for the wrong gathering and needed gentle redirection. I set the phone down without replying and made my tea. Then I did something I had not done in years. I went into the hall closet and pulled out the old accordion file where I kept property records, insurance papers, tax receipts, and the practical bones of the life Thomas and I had built. I carried it to the dining room table and opened it beneath the morning light. The folders were labeled in my handwriting, neat and square, each year tucked behind the next. Roof repair, dock permit, county taxes, utility statements, warranty on the water heater. I ran my fingers over the tabs and felt a steadiness come over me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with memory. Thomas used to joke that I was the real records office in this family. He handled the hammer and the fishing poles. I handled everything with dates and signatures and stamps. He trusted me with that because he trusted me with what mattered. At the bottom of the file was a cream-colored envelope with our attorney's name printed in the upper left corner. I had not opened it since the month after Thomas died. Inside was a copy of the deed, the transfer documents, and the letter our attorney had asked me to keep with the permanent records. I sat down slowly before reading it again. The cottage was mine. Not eventually. Not in spirit. Not in some sentimental family sense people like to talk about when they wanted access to things they had not earned. Legally, clearly, fully mine. Thomas had seen to that. He had done it quietly, the way he did most serious things, without speeches or grand gestures. There was a handwritten note clipped to the copy of the deed in his careful block print. Evelyn knows what home means. That line undid me more than the messages had. Not because it made me cry. I did not cry. I simply sat there with my hand resting over the paper and let the truth move through me like something old and familiar. Rachel had spent years redecorating rooms. Daniel had spent years surrendering ground inch by inch. But neither of them had ever bothered to understand the foundation beneath their assumptions. They were behaving like owners because I had spent too long acting like a guest in my own life. By the time the tea had gone lukewarm beside me, I knew two things with complete certainty. First, I would never ask to be allowed into that cottage again. Second, before this was over, I was going to remind both of them that there is a difference between being invited somewhere and actually belonging there. By 10 o'clock that morning, the house no longer felt like a place where I had been wounded. It felt like a place where I could think. That was an important difference. Pain can make a room feel smaller, but clarity has a way of opening windows, even when they are closed. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, slipped Thomas's note back into the envelope, and carried everything to the desk in the den where we used to pay bills together on Sunday evenings. The desk was old oak, scratched along one edge where Daniel had once dragged a toy fire truck across it while I balanced the checkbook. I sat down in the same chair I had used for years and opened my laptop. Outside, a lawn service was working somewhere down the block. I could hear the low drone of a mower rising and falling in the distance. It was such an ordinary sound that it almost made me smile. There is something deeply insulting about the way life stays ordinary while your family is quietly trying to write you out of it. I searched the county property records first, not because I doubted the documents in front of me, but because I wanted to see the truth displayed in the same cold public language everyone else had to respect. Parcel number, legal owner, transfer date, mailing address. There it was, plain and unromantic, exactly as Thomas had arranged it. No Daniel. No shared family trust. No hidden clause that turned sentiment into ownership. Just my name, sitting there in black type on a white screen, solid as a locked door. I leaned back and looked at it for a long moment. My name had not disappeared from the place just because my son and his wife had gotten comfortable pretending it had. Around noon, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw the name of our neighbor at the lake, Nancy Bell. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Nancy had lived 3 cottages down for as long as I could remember. She was the sort of woman who knew every contractor within 20 miles, kept extra hot dog buns in her freezer in case someone forgot theirs, and could deliver gossip with the sweet voice of a church soloist. "Evelyn, honey," she said, and I could already hear that careful tone people use when they are about to step near a bruise. "I hope I am not bothering you." "Not at all," I said. "I was just at home." "Well," she replied, "I just wanted to check on something. Rachel mentioned yesterday that you were staying in town and that the cottage was basically theirs now, so I was not sure whether to bring over the folding chairs she borrowed for the deck or ask Daniel where he wanted them stored after the renovations." I did not say anything for a second. I let the sentence settle. "Renovations. There's now." Asked Daniel. I pictured Rachel standing on that back deck with her sunglasses pushed into her hair, saying these things in the easy tone people use when they assume no one will challenge them. "Thank you for telling me, Nancy," I said at last. "There are no renovations approved that I know of." "Oh," Nancy said, And in that single syllable, I heard her recalculating everything. Well, I thought you might want to know. She said something about opening up the kitchen wall before fall and redoing the primary bedroom in lighter tones. I closed my eyes briefly. The primary bedroom. That was what younger people called it now, I knew. But in my mind it was still our room, the one with the brass lamp on Thomas's side and the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, where I kept extra blankets for chilly nights by the water. I appreciate the call, I told her. Truly. After we hung up, I sat very still with the phone in my hand. Then I opened the drawer where I kept business cards and found the one I was looking for. Mark Ellison, attorney at law. He had handled our estate papers years ago and had sent a handwritten sympathy note after Thomas died. I had not spoken to him in over 3 years. When his receptionist answered, I gave my name and was transferred almost immediately. Evelyn, Mark said in that calm, even voice I remembered. It is good to hear from you, though I suspect there is a reason. There is, I said. And for the first time since Friday afternoon, I heard something in my own voice that had been missing before. Not pleading, not confusion, not hurt. Resolve. I would like to review my options regarding the lake property. There was a short pause on the line, papers shifting faintly in the background. Then he said, very simply, of course. Can you come in at 2? Mark Ellison's office was on the second floor of an old brick building downtown, above a pharmacy that still sold greeting cards, reading glasses, and those little tins of butter. Mints by the register. I had not been there since the month after Thomas died, and stepping back into that waiting room felt like walking into a version of myself I had hoped I would never need again. The receptionist greeted me kindly, offered coffee, and led me to the conference room with the long walnut table and the framed watercolor of the courthouse square. Everything smelled faintly of paper, polished wood, and air conditioning that had been running too long. Mark came in carrying a legal pad and a slim file folder, his silver hair thinner than I remembered, but his manner exactly the same. He shook my hand, looked at my face for half a second longer than politeness required, and did not ask if I was all right. Good attorneys, I have learned, understand that question is often useless. Instead, he sat down, folded his glasses, and said, "Tell me what happened." So I did. I told him about the text messages, about the years of small rearrangements that had slowly turned into something uglier, about Nancy's call and Rachel speaking of renovations as if the place already belonged to them. I did not dramatize it. I did not need to. The facts were humiliating enough on their own. Mark listened without interrupting, making a few notes in that compact, tidy handwriting lawyers seemed to learn somewhere along the way. When I finished, he opened the folder and slid a copy of the deed toward me, though by then I no longer needed the reminder. As of this moment, he said, the property remains solely and fully yours. No one can authorize construction, transfer ownership, or use it as collateral without your consent. If anyone has represented otherwise, they have done so without legal standing. I let out a breath I had not realized I had been holding. The words should have comforted me, and in one sense they did. But they also brought a different kind of sorrow with them. It is a painful thing to discover that while you were trying to preserve a family place, other people were testing the edges of what they could take from it. Mark must have seen something shift in my expression, because his voice softened. Evelyn, he said, you have options. You can formally restrict access. You can issue written notice. You can change the locks and document everything. Or, if you prefer a cleaner break, you can sell. The room went still around that word. Sell. It should have shocked me, but it did not. In fact, it landed with a strange sense of order, as though it had been waiting quietly in the corner all along for me to be ready to look at it directly. I thought of the dock, the porch swing, the little window in the kitchen over the sink where I used to watch the water darken at dusk while corn boiled on the stove. I thought of Thomas laughing as he tried to coax damp firewood into a flame. I thought of Daniel at 8, running down the hill in a life jacket too big for him. Then I thought of Rachel discussing wall removals and paint colors, and of my son deciding that peace meant his mother staying away. Memory and reality stood side by side in my mind like two people who no longer recognized each other. If I sold, I asked quietly, how quickly could it be done? Mark leaned back slightly. In the current market, lake properties move fast, especially well-maintained ones. If you want discretion and speed, I know a broker who handles private listings. Serious buyers only. No open house circus. I looked down at my hands folded on the table. They were steady. That surprised me most of all. I had spent years thinking strength would feel louder when it arrived, but it did not. It felt like this. Calm. Clear. A decision making room for itself. Then that is what I want, I said. Mark studied me for a moment, not questioning, only measuring whether I understood the weight of what I was saying. I did. He nodded once and reached for his phone. "I am going to make a call," he said. By the time I left his office an hour later, the first appointment had already been scheduled for the next morning. I stepped out onto the sidewalk into the hard, bright light of early afternoon, and for the first time all weekend, I did not feel shut out. I felt finished with asking. The broker's name was Linda Mercer, and she arrived at my house the next morning at 9:15 in a navy blazer, low heels, and the kind of composed expression that suggested she had seen every possible version of family tension wrapped around a piece of property. She carried a leather folder, a tablet, and a stainless steel travel mug that smelled faintly of cinnamon. When I opened the door, she smiled with professional warmth and said, "Mrs. Harper, Mark told me a little, but not much." That was exactly how I wanted it. Not much. Only what was necessary. I led her into the dining room, where the property file was already waiting on the table in a neat stack beside a yellow legal pad. Sunlight came through the front windows in long, bright bands, catching the dust in the air and making everything look more delicate than it felt. Linda sat down, reviewed the deed, the tax records, the maintenance receipts, and the recent inspection report I had kept from the previous year when the chimney needed minor work. She moved through the papers quickly but carefully, nodding once or twice in a way that let me know order still had value in this world. "This is a very attractive listing," she said, "especially with lake access, updated systems, and the lot size. We will not have trouble finding interest." I folded my hands in my lap. "I do not want crowds walking through it," I said. "No signs. No neighbors talking. No weekend parade of strangers in wet shoes." She gave a small smile. "Private listing, then. Qualified buyers only. We can keep it discreet." That word again. Discreet. So much of my life these past few years had required discretion from me, while other people enjoyed entitlement in plain view. Still, now it served a purpose I could live with. Linda asked practical questions in a calm, measured tone. Square footage. Age of the roof. When the septic had last been serviced. Whether the boat lift was included. I answered each one clearly. It felt strangely empowering to describe the property not as memory, not as tradition, but as fact. 3 bedrooms. 2 full baths. New water heater installed 4 years ago. Dock repaired after storm damage. West-facing porch with sunset view. For so long I had been treated as though I were sentimental and difficult, a woman clinging to old things because she could not move on. But there is a difference between sentiment and stewardship. One is about longing. The other is about work. And I had done the work. By 11 o'clock, Linda had taken photographs from the packet I kept in the file, and by noon she was leaving with enough information to begin quietly contacting serious buyers. Before she left, she paused by the front door and asked, "Would you prefer I communicate only through your attorney, or directly with you as well?" "Directly," I said, "but copy Mark on everything." She nodded, understanding at once that I was not confused, not fragile, and not to be sidestepped. After she left, I stood in the foyer for a long moment with one hand on the doorknob. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by intention. Around 1:30, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "We are staying through Monday. Rachel invited a few friends for dinner Sunday. Thought you should know in case you were planning to come up next week." I looked at the screen and nearly laughed, though there was no humor in it. Thought you should know. As if I were the one who needed informing. As if he were granting me courtesy from inside a place he had no right to manage. I did not answer. Instead, I walked to the hall closet, took out my light jacket, and drove to the bank. There, in a quiet office with a woman half my age who called me ma'am 3 times in 10 minutes, I opened a new account in my name only and arranged for all future proceeds related to the sale to be deposited there. Then I stopped at the grocery store on the way home and bought ground coffee, fresh fruit, and a loaf of rye bread, because there is something deeply satisfying about making practical plans while other people are still busy underestimating you. By late afternoon, Linda called. "I have 2 interested buyers already," she said. "One is local. Cash. Very serious. Wants to see it tomorrow if possible." I looked out the kitchen window as she spoke. The hydrangeas were still fading along the fence. The bird feeder swayed again in the same small breeze. Everything outside remained ordinary. Inside, however, something had changed completely. Tomorrow. Works, I said. Then, after the briefest pause, I added, they are at the property this weekend. Linda was silent for a beat, then answered in the tone of someone adjusting her understanding. I see. Do they have legal tenancy? No, I said. They do not. Her response was simple. Then we proceed carefully. When I hung up, I stood at the counter and let the words settle over me. We proceed carefully. Not dramatically. Not cruelly. Carefully. That had always been my way. Rachel mistook quiet for weakness. Daniel mistook patience for permission. By the time the light faded from the kitchen floor that evening, both of them were about to learn how costly those mistakes could become. Sunday arrived bright and clear, one of those late summer days that make the lake look almost unreal, all silver light and blue distance, the kind of day Rachel would have called perfect for entertaining. I did not drive up there. I did not need to. By 9:30 that morning, Linda had already met the buyer at a coffee shop in town and called me from her car outside the marina. His name was Peter Lawson, recently retired, no children at home, cash buyer, serious about moving quickly. He had grown up spending summers on a nearby lake and wanted something quiet, well-kept, and close enough to town for hardware store runs and decent pie. I liked him immediately for that last detail alone. Linda did not oversell. She never did. She simply said, he understands the property. He values care. That mattered to me more than any dollar figure she could have mentioned. Around 10:15, she called again. We are heading in now, she said. I could hear the soft click of her turn signal through the phone. Are you comfortable proceeding? I stood in my kitchen with one hand resting on the counter, looking at the bread box Thomas bought at a church rummage sale 20 years earlier because he said no decent kitchen should leave a loaf out on the counter uncovered. Yes, I said. Proceed. Then I set the phone down and waited. There is a particular stillness that comes before something irreversible. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply settles into the room and asks whether you are prepared to live differently once the next hour has passed. I made myself toast I did not eat. I rinsed the same coffee cup twice. At 11 o'clock, Linda called again, and this time I could hear voices in the background. Not loud, just the distant blur of surprise colliding with inconvenience. Well, she said in her measured voice, they were not expecting visitors. I pictured Rachel on the porch in one of her pale linen sets, sunglasses on top of her head, a tray of drinks half arranged on the outdoor table, as if she were hostess of an estate that had risen naturally around her. I pictured Daniel standing a few steps behind, holding the screen door open, already uncomfortable but not yet willing to call anything what it was. Did they cooperate? I asked. Eventually, Linda said. I had to make it clear that I was there with a prospective purchaser and that the property owner had authorized the visit. There was a pause. Rachel seemed confused by the phrase property owner. I almost smiled. Almost. Peter viewed the house thoroughly, Linda continued. He was especially interested in the updated systems and the lot line. He also liked the west porch and the original stone fireplace. I thought of Thomas laying that stone one autumn with a friend from church, both of them pretending they understood masonry better than they did. He would have liked hearing that. Daniel said very little, Linda added. But Rachel had several questions. Such as, I asked, whether this was a joke, whether there had been a misunderstanding, whether they had some kind of right to remain through the end of the weekend. Linda let the silence sit for a moment before finishing in the same steady tone. I told her occupancy at the owner's discretion is not the same as possession. I turned away from the sink and sat down at the table. The sentence was so clean, so exact, that I wished I had said it myself years earlier. What does Mr. Lawson think? I asked. He is interested, Linda said. Very. He asked whether you would entertain a same-day offer if the numbers were right. I looked at the clock on the stove. 11:12. At the cottage, Rachel's friends were probably still arriving with pasta salad, bottles of chilled white wine, folding chairs, and the easy assumptions of people invited into someone else's certainty. Yes, I said. If the numbers are right, I will. Linda called back 40 minutes later with the offer. It was fair. More than fair, really. Cash. Quick close. Minimal contingencies. Serious money placed on paper in neat lines that carried none of the sentiment, but all of the authority that family had apparently stopped recognizing. Mark reviewed everything and called to say the terms were solid. If you want this finished, Evelyn, He told me, "This is your moment." So I signed. Not at the cottage, not in anger, not in front of Rachel or Daniel or anyone who might mistake spectacle for strength. I signed at my own dining room table with a black pen, sunlight crossing the wood, and Thomas's note folded back inside the file beside me. Evelyn knows what home means. By early afternoon, the documents were in motion, and the cottage no longer belonged to the son who had let his wife erase me from it. The remarkable thing was how little noise it made when a false story finally collapsed. No thunder, no grand speech, just paper, ink, and the quiet sound of people discovering they had been living inside an assumption that was never theirs to keep. The first call came from Rachel at 3:20 in the afternoon. I watched her name flash across my screen and let it ring until it stopped. Then Daniel called. Then Rachel again. Then both of them began texting in the frantic, overlapping way people do when the ground shifts beneath them and they cannot decide whether outrage or panic will serve them better. What is going on? Linda says there is a sale. Mom, call me now. Rachel says this has to be a mistake. You cannot do this while we are here. I read every message once and answered none of them. Silence, I had learned, is unbearable to people who are used to controlling the story. By 4 o'clock, the calls had slowed, replaced by a long text from Daniel that began with "I do not understand" and ended with "This feels extreme." That sentence sat on the screen for a moment before I set the phone down beside the sugar bowl and went back to slicing apples for a small crisp I had not planned to make. I peeled each one carefully, turning the fruit in my hand, watching the ribbons of skin fall in soft curls onto the cutting board. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to mellow. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then stopped. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood returned again, as if to remind me that private earthquakes do not register on public maps. At 5:10, Daniel pulled into my driveway. I saw his truck through the front window before I heard the knock. He came alone. That told me more than his messages had. Rachel had likely wanted to come, to argue, to accuse, to make herself the center of the wound. But Daniel knew this conversation would land differently if he arrived without her voice beside him. I opened the door before he could knock a second time. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with travel. His shirt was wrinkled, his jaw unshaven, and there was a stiffness around his eyes I recognized from the years when he used to get caught in lies as a teenager and still believed a careful tone might undo the fact of what had already happened. "Mom," he said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. "What are you doing?" I closed the door gently behind him. "I am making apple crisp," I said. He stared at me as if the answer were insulting, which in a way, I suppose, it was. He followed me into the kitchen, where the peeled apples sat in a ceramic bowl and the cinnamon jar was still open on the counter. "You sold the cottage," he said. There was disbelief in his voice, but beneath it, something else too. Injury. Ownership wounded by correction. I folded brown sugar into flour and butter with a pastry cutter, keeping my eyes on the bowl. "Yes," I said. "I did. You sold it while we were there." He said it like an accusation, as though timing were the crime and not everything that had made the timing necessary. "Linda brought a buyer to view a property I own," I replied. "You happened to be occupying it." Daniel let out a short breath and ran a hand over the back of his neck. "Rachel is beside herself." I looked up then. "Rachel," I said, "was not beside herself when she told you to tell me I was not family." He flinched. It was small, but I saw it. I saw, too, the instant he understood this was not about logistics. Not really. It was about the sentence he had chosen to deliver on her behalf, because somewhere along the way he had decided his comfort mattered more than my dignity. "Mom," he began, "it was a bad weekend. Things were tense. Rachel thought it would be easier if there was less friction." "Less friction," I repeated. "Daniel, I carried that family for decades without asking anyone to notice the weight of it. I paid the taxes on that place. I arranged the repairs. I kept it standing after your father died. And on Friday, you sent me a message telling me not to come to my own cottage because your wife said I was not family." He opened his mouth, but I did not let him interrupt. You do not get to erase someone and then call her reaction extreme when she finally stops, leaving the door unlocked. The kitchen went quiet. Even the air seemed to hold still between us. Daniel looked down at the floor the way he used to when he was 12 and knew he had disappointed me. Except now he was a grown man in my house, wearing a wedding ring and confusion like armor. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Some truths are sharpest when spoken plainly. The cottage was not lost today, I told him. You lost it the moment you agreed that I was somehow outside the family that your father and I built. Selling it only made the paperwork match the truth. Daniel stood in my kitchen for another full minute after that, as if he expected the room itself to intervene on his behalf. The late afternoon sun had shifted across the counter by then, turning the glass sugar jar amber at the edges and throwing a warm strip of light over the floor between us. He looked older in that light. Not wiser, just older. There is a difference. He opened his mouth once, closed it, then finally sat down at the table without asking. I finished spreading the topping over the apples and slid the dish into the oven. Only then did I turn back to him. He had both forearms braced. On the table, hands clasped tight, staring at the wood grain as if some answer might rise from it. I do not know what you want me to say, he said quietly. The sentence was honest, I will give him that. For once, there was no Rachel says, no careful softening, no attempt to make cruelty sound practical. Just a man who had let things go too far and had arrived late to the realization that late still counts as late. You do not need to say much, I told him. You needed to understand. He looked up then, and in his face I saw flickers of the boy he had been, the one who used to wait by the window for Thomas to come home, the one who once cried when a wounded sparrow died in a shoebox lined with dish towels because he could not bear the idea of something small and trusting being neglected. That boy was not gone, but he had been buried under years of convenience, accommodation, and the dangerous laziness of letting somebody else define what was fair. Rachel thinks, Rachel prefers, Rachel did not mean it that way. Every marriage asks for loyalty. I understand that. But there is a line between building a life with your wife and allowing her to redraw the borders of your conscience. I should have shut it down sooner, he said at last, so softly I almost missed it. Yes, I said. You should have. The timer on the oven had not even been set yet, but the house had already filled with the scent of cinnamon and butter, warm and familiar in a way family had not felt for some time. Daniel glanced toward the kitchen, then back at me. What happens now? It was the kind of question people ask when they are finally forced to stop arguing with consequences and begin living inside them. I sat across from him and folded my hands on the table. The sale will close. You and Rachel will remove your things. Mark will handle the details. If there are keys that need returning, they will be returned. He nodded once, absorbing each sentence as if it carried more weight than he had expected. And us? He asked after a moment, his voice thinner now. What happens with us? That was the only question that mattered, really, and also the one I had no interest in answering cheaply. People love easy endings. Reunions over pie. Tears that fix everything. One good apology and a swell of music in the background. Real life is quieter than that, and harder. I looked at my son for a long time before I spoke. That depends on whether you are sorry I sold the cottage, or sorry you agreed with a woman who told you your mother was not family. His eyes dropped at once. There it was. Not confusion, not even anger. Shame, plain and unmistakable. I did not press it further. Shame is only useful if a person is willing to sit with it long enough to change. At some point, Daniel stood up and said he should go. I walked him to the door. On the porch, he hesitated. One hand on the railing Thomas had painted every other spring without fail. I am sorry, Mom, he said, and this time there was no explanation attached, no defense hiding behind the words. I believed he meant it. I also knew meaning it was not the same as mending it. I nodded, because that was all I had to offer. After he drove away, I stood at the front window and watched the street settle back into evening. The apple crisp baked in the oven. A few leaves skittered along the curb in the breeze. Somewhere, a screen door slammed and a lawn sprinkler clicked to life. The world remained ordinary, and that felt right. Losing illusions does not end the day. It simply changes what you carry into the next one. When the timer finally rang, I took the crisp out and set it on the stove to cool. The smell filled the kitchen, sweet and steady. I realized then that I did not feel triumphant. I felt something better. I felt returned to myself. My son had not lost a cottage because I sold it. He lost it when he forgot that a home built by love cannot belong to people who treat love like it is optional. And as the evening light faded from the counters and the house grew softly dim around me, I understood that peace was not being invited back into places that had rejected me. Peace was knowing I no longer needed the invitation at all.